Well, hey there. I'm Joshua Johnson. It is Monday, February 21st. Good to be with you on this President's Day. Here's some of what we're talking about tonight. Vladimir Putin appears to be laying the groundwork for war. He just ordered troops into Ukraine. So is the invasion a done deal? And what might prevent it? A former U.S. ambassador to Russia joins us next. A jury is deliberating federal hate crime charges against the men convicted of killing Ahmaud Arbery. But hate crimes can be very hard to prosecute. Why is that? Plus, COVID cases are falling across the country, but it can be hard to lean into the good news after 2 traumatic years of this pandemic. What should we talk about when we talk about COVID? And how can we keep landfills from releasing so many greenhouse gases? We'll see how a town in Idaho plans to turn those gases into something else. So a Russian invasion into Ukraine might be a done deal based on what happened today. Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered his military into 2 separatist regions of the country. Today he justified it by signing an independence decree on state television. The decree formally recognized the separatist regions of Ukraine as independent. Those areas are Donetsk and Luhansk. But the separatists do not control all of those regions. Separatists backed by Russia have partially controlled Donetsk and Luhansk, which you see there on the map, since 2014. That was the last time Russia invaded Ukraine and annexed Crimea. There are plenty of Ukrainian troops stationed there as well, and these regions are, of course, still part of Ukraine, not Russia. This evening, President Biden signed an executive order prohibiting trade, new investment, and finance by U.S. individuals and entities to or from that part of eastern Ukraine. Similar announcements came in from European leaders as well. The UK's foreign minister tweeted that it will announce sanctions tomorrow. The European Union calls the move, quote, a blatant violation of international law, as well as a breach of a ceasefire agreement Russia and Ukraine signed in 2015 to maintain peace in eastern Ukraine. Also, the UN Security Council will hold an emergency meeting tonight at 9 p.m. Eastern. Ukraine had submitted a request for an urgent meeting just today. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed his nation in the wee hours of the morning there. We're still turning around some of the tape, but we know that he called Russia's actions a violation of Ukraine's sovereignty. Now, before today, Secretary of State Antony Blinken had been scheduled to meet his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, this week. And President Biden appeared to agree on principle to meeting with Mr. Putin. Both of those meetings were contingent upon Russia not further invading Ukraine. So, has the door to diplomacy been shut for good? Has the invasion essentially begun? Or is there still a viable path toward preventing an attack? Let's bring in NBC News analyst Michael McFaul. He's a former U.S. ambassador to Russia, and recently he tweeted, quote, Russia is invading Ukraine right now, unquote. Ambassador McFaul, welcome back. Good to see you again.
Glad to be back.
So is it basically kind of all over but the crying? I mean, it seems like Vladimir Putin has been sort of, playing this game, trying to gaslight the rest of the world about what he's been doing. And now he seems to have just come out and said it, that, it was a mistake that Ukraine ever broke away in the first place. And we're signing these independence decrees. And this is kind of the way it's going to be. Like, is this sort of a done deal at this point?
Well, today was a very momentous day in the development of this ongoing crisis, and I would call it a tragedy. First of all, what is happening today, in my view, is an invasion. Just let's keep it simple. If country X sends its soldiers into country Y, unannounced and uninvited by country Y, that's an invasion. I don't know what other word we're supposed to use. Incursion, minor something or other. It's an invasion of the sovereignty of Ukraine. It doesn't mean it's the last step of the invasion. Let's also be clear about that. And listening to what Putin said today, that was a fiery speech. That was not a man that sounded like he wanted to negotiate or pivot towards diplomacy. I tragically fear this is the first step of something much bigger. But today was a big turning point. Russian troops are invading Ukraine right now. That is a fact. That is what's happening in Ukraine today.
Now, President Biden imposed sanctions on these regions that have these Russian-backed separatists in them. What impact do you think that that will have compared to, say, the other moves that maybe we could hear from the UK or whatever might come out of this Security Council meeting tonight?
Well, I don't think these sanctions were enough, in my view. If it is invasion, right, this is the parsing of these words. Not everybody's agreeing to call it invasion like I am, so that's maybe why they're saving, to wait for other things. And I get that logic, by the way. I want to be clear about that. The Biden administration is anticipating a much bigger military operation in other parts of Ukraine, including maybe all of Ukraine. We don't know as far as Putin will go. And so they're trying to keep their powder dry so that when that happens, they can respond with the full comprehensive set of economic sanctions that they've negotiated with our allies and partners in Europe and around the world. But I think that what they did today was not enough. It was not enough to sanction just these regions and people that do business there. I mean, come on. How many people do business in these two places in the United States? I hope and suspect you'll actually see a bigger response, even from the United States, as well as some of the other countries that you mentioned by tomorrow.
I do want to note, just to the ambassador's point, that the fact sheet from the White House that describes this executive order does say, quote, this EO, executive order, this EO is distinct from the swift and severe economic measures we are prepared to issue with allies and partners in response to a further Russian invasion of Ukraine. It goes on to read, quote, we are continuing to closely consult with Ukraine and with allies and partners on next steps and urge Russia to immediately de-escalate, unquote. That's part of the fact sheet that came from the White House describing what this executive order does. So in terms of what happens now, Ambassador, there's going to be this UN Security Council meeting. Talk to us about what the next steps look like. There are a bunch of meetings that look like they're ready to happen, including between Secretary of State Blinken and Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, maybe even between President Biden and President Putin. So it looks like the door is still very much open for this not to necessarily end with another invasion.
Very much is too strong, Joshua. So the door's open. You're right. The door is slightly open, but it's not as open as it was 24 hours ago, in my view. They said we'll meet if there's no invasion. Well, there was an invasion. So how does President Biden go and meet with Putin? And I really want to underscore this point. Putin today, you're showing the video of it. He is signing a decree saying that these two territories of a sovereign country are now independent countries. Think about how monumental that is. We're so focused on the big military intervention that we're losing sight of how giant a step Putin just take. I mean, imagine, President Biden sits down and signs a decree saying we now think that Alberta is an independent country. Think about the reaction there would be in the world about that, and yet somehow we're not calling this for what it is. So I hope that changes. I hope there'll be a bigger response. And at this point, I'm not optimistic. If Lavrov wants to meet with Secretary Blinken and maybe talk about something to avert a greater war, we should try to do that. Biden should try to do it if it's available. But Vladimir Putin today wasn't just talking about NATO expansion. He was talking about a much bigger set of grievances that he has. And I don't see a negotiation pathway that can deal with all the grievances that he laid out in his speech today. I hope I'm wrong, but I fear I'm right.
Yeah, could you dig into that a little bit more? I'm just looking at a translation from Reuters of some of what he said today. And he talked, among other things, about Vladimir Lenin. He talked about the Bolshevik policy. He went all the way back to 1917 and Ukraine's history with the Soviet Union. Like, this is not just about what's happening on the ground with Ukraine today. This is a lot bigger. Like, Ukraine is a representative example of something much bigger and more hegemonic that Vladimir Putin has in mind. It sort of represents something else.
I think you're right about that. And I think that's been the story the whole way throughout this entire crisis. There are just too many people talking about NATO and what Gorbachev said to Jim Baker 30 years ago, pretending to believe that this was all about NATO expansion. Now, NATO expansion is a component of it. I don't want to dismiss it entirely. But Putin just laid it out tonight. For him, he has a set of grievances that go back to the collapse of the Soviet Union, which he said was the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. Think about that for a minute. Just pause for a moment. Think about what happened in the 20th century. For him, this was the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. And he wants to right those wrongs from his perspective, right? He thinks we took advantage of Russia when they're weak and that the Slavic nation was unfairly and unjustly divided. That is the punchline. And he's been saying it pretty openly for a long time, by the way. At least I've heard him say it many, many times, including in the room with him a couple of times when I still worked in the government. And so if that's your goal, to unite all the Slavic nations, a negotiation with us about NATO expansion or not is not going to solve that particular problem. And there's one other thing I think is really important to say about this move today. Remember, Putin has gone to war 4 times already in his career. He's been in power for over 2 decades, right? Chechnya, 1999. Georgia, 2008. Ukraine, 2014. Syria, 2015. In every single one of those wars, from his perspective, he won. And by the way, I would have to agree with him on that. He won, and the reaction from the West, every time we were going to do this, that, and the other, he's lived through. So that makes him, I think, ready to take even riskier behavior. And tragically, that's what I expect in the coming days.
Michael McFaul, former U.S. ambassador to Russia. I have a feeling we're going to be talking a lot more in the days to come, but I appreciate you making time tonight. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
We heard from President Zelensky of Ukraine not too long ago. He called Russia's actions, in his words, a violation of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Now, as we mentioned, Ukraine requested a UN Security Council meeting. They're going to hold that emergency meeting in the next hour. While we wait for that, let's get a sense of how the Ukrainian people are doing right now. And let's go live to Kyiv, where NBC's Aaron McLaughlin is standing by. Aaron, after that speech, characterize perhaps the mood on the ground, or at least the mood that President Zelensky was trying to elicit by giving that speech.
Well, President Zelensky, in that speech that he delivered to the country at 2 o'clock in the morning after speaking to any number of world leaders, including President Biden, as well as the British Prime Minister, struck a defiant tone. I have an excerpt here of the speech. I'll read it to you. He says, "We are on our own land. We are not afraid of anything or anyone. We owe nothing to anyone, and we will not give anything to anyone. And we are sure of that because now is not February 2014, but February 2022. Another country, another army, one goal, peace in Ukraine, glory to Ukraine." He also talked about how Ukraine was going to continue pursuing this diplomatic path, even though what appears to be Russia is unilaterally withdrawn from the Minsk agreement, seen as the primary way in which a diplomatic resolution to this crisis could be reached. He said he was going to take the matter to the UN Security Council. That meeting's expected to happen shortly. He's also consulting with the OSCE as well as the Normandy format. So President Zelensky tonight is really trying every diplomatic avenue to resolve this crisis. The question is, will it be effective? And of course, what will Russian President Vladimir Putin do next? He's sending in these peacekeepers, so-called peacekeepers, they're really troops, into Donetsk and Luhansk. And what will be their next move? Will those troops cross the line of contact? And if they do, how will the Ukrainian military respond? These are all questions looming over Kyiv tonight. I was speaking to people who watched President Putin's address, and they said it was ominous. I was talking to a former advisor to President Zelensky, and he said that it feels like 1939. And he said that he believes, given what President Putin had to say earlier today, that he feels that President Putin's going to go for the whole of Ukraine. That's really kind of the mood in Kyiv tonight, Josh.
Before I have to let you go, Aaron, one more piece of President Zelensky's speech. He said, and this is a theme he's repeated many times, he said, quote, "We're calm, we're grown-ups, we've been ready for this for a long time. There is no reason for your sleepless night," unquote. Aaron, before I have to let you go, what is your sense of whether Ukrainians believe that, whether they believe that Ukraine is ready to repel another Russian invasion?
Well, Ukrainians have been remarkably defiant and calm throughout this crisis, the ones that I have been speaking to. They're preparing for the worst at the same time. I was outside Kyiv one weekend and watched as ordinary men and women, elderly teenagers, participated in military training. They were learning how to fire a gun. They were learning how to evacuate the wounded, administer first aid, all preparing for the possibility that a Russian invasion could one day happen. This has been seen as a reality. This is a country that has been at war essentially for 8 years. They're subject to cyber attacks, bomb threats, any number of disinformation. I was outside the U.S. Embassy a week ago, and there was a fake protest, essentially. Our investigation found protesters were actually paid. It's these sort of tactics that they've been dealing with for quite some time, in addition to the violence that we've been seeing in the east of the country. And really the sense you get from them that they are expecting the worst, and in the meantime, planning to stay and to defend and to do what it takes to preserve their freedom. That is really kind of the themes that have been echoed in many of the conversations I've had here in Ukraine, Josh.
Well, we've heard from President Putin of Russia. We've heard from President Zelensky of Ukraine. We'll see what comes out of this Security Council meeting tonight and what first light brings tomorrow. Thank you, Aaron. That's NBC's Aaron McLaughlin reporting live for us tonight from Kyiv. Still to come, the 3 men convicted of killing Ahmaud Arbery are on trial once again. But how will the jury decide how much these men were motivated by race? We're glad you're with us for Now Tonight from NBC News. Were the 3 white men convicted of murdering Ahmaud Arbery motivated by race? That's what a jury is deliberating in a federal hate crimes trial. This Wednesday will mark 2 years since Mr. Arbery, who was black, was shot dead while jogging in Brunswick, Georgia. Last month, all 3 men were sentenced to life in prison for killing the 25-year-old. Now, that was the state trial. Its focus was on Mr. Arbery's homicide. This federal trial is different. It will determine whether Mr. Arbery's race played a specific role in his murder. A number of witnesses testified that 2 of the 3 defendants have a history of racism. But what does it take to prove that in court? Hate crimes are notoriously difficult to prosecute. Justice Department data show nearly 1,900 suspects investigated between 2005 and 2019. The DOJ only pursued about 17% of them for prosecution. Most of the rest were let go because of a lack of evidence. Joining us now is Professor Brian Levin. He's the director of the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at Cal State San Bernardino. Professor, good to see you again. Welcome.
Likewise. Thank you so much, Josh. It's always fun being on your show.
So first of all, just the basics in terms of these charges. Why were these pursued at the federal level rather than, say, the state level?
Great question. In the past, if there was a successful state prosecution, oftentimes the Justice Department would not file a criminal civil rights case like this. However, starting around 2010 or so, after the passage the previous year of the Shepard-Byrd Hate Crime Act, which broadened the application of federal law, we actually saw charging even when there was state convictions. And just remember, just briefly, that does not violate double jeopardy because they're different sovereigns, what we say in the law, different governments. So if I shot someone from the California border into Arizona, for instance, the feds might have a case, certainly Arizona would and California would. So there's no double jeopardy when it's separate sovereigns. One last quick point. Interestingly about this, it's not just hate crime, for instance. There's also kidnapping. If you stop someone's movement, generally, if it's substantial, it'll be a kidnapping. But the federal hate crime charges against these defendants who have already been convicted for this lynching in state court. A couple of quick things. One is they're using a 1968 statute, not the newest one. They're using kind of the classic. And what that requires is not a higher level of proof, if you will, but 2 hurdles of the same size. So what I mean is they not only have to show that Mr. Arbery was killed because of his race, but also because of his exercise of a particular federal right that is listed in that older statute. In this case, using the federal highways and sidewalks that are funded by federal tax dollars.
So, as we mentioned, there are so few of these hate crime matters that end up being prosecuted due to a lack of evidence. Also, Georgia did not have this hate crimes law. It was passed after this all happened, so that was a factor. But just with regards to the evidentiary standard, what does it take in court to prove racial animus to the level of securing this kind of a conviction?
What a great question, and I'm so glad you asked, because I actually wrote a couple of Supreme Court briefs on this very topic. First, the U.S. Supreme Court has found that state hate crime laws that are well crafted are constitutional, as long as they punish underlying crimes and not create a hate speech kind of criminalization. But subsequently, in the year 2000, in another case involving African-American victims, one thing really quickly here, let me break it to you. 2020 was the worst year for anti-Black hate crimes since 2008, when President Obama had a political ascent. But June, shortly after Mr. Arbery's lynching, the George Floyd lynching, we saw not only an increase in social justice protests, but listen to this, breaking it to you live on television with myself and some of my friends from West Virginia, National Contagion Research Institute. What we found was it was the worst month for anti-Black hate crimes since FBI data started being recorded in 91. So this was at a time, 2020, when racial hate crimes really burst through, and unfortunately, it started cracking. And then after George Floyd's lynching, we really saw an explosion. But what is needed, as far as the Supreme Court has said, is the law has to be narrowly tailored. And it also said if you're going to have to prove a racial bias, that's what they did in this New Jersey case, where a neighbor shot into his new Black neighbor's front door, said, no, I didn't like the purple Hoover. The judge found by a lower standard, preponderance of evidence, that's what you have in civil case, just a slight tip of the scale. Supreme Court said, no, you not only have to show that the crime took place, but the racial motive or other group animus type motive must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt when the penalty is like having another charge. In this case, the actual proving of a racial motivation is critical, because when Vernon Jordan was shot in 1980, what the jury found was, yes, he was shot because he was African American, but the jury did not find that he was shot to interfere with his right to use the Fort Wayne Marriott Hotel, a public accommodation that is covered in the law. In this case, though, I think they did a masterful job. We had 5 hours of closing arguments, and what they said was, hey, they used this horrible language, which we're not going to repeat here, consistently. And yes, there might have been thefts in the area, but why only? Of all the multitudinous people that come through, why do you stalk an African American like this? It shows that we have to change the defense laws, and we also have to help prosecutors and police be able to get the evidence into trial. One quick last thing, sorry. In California, we're looking to make model policies and model intake protocols mandatory. I think all states should do that. The South has the largest proportion of African Americans and the lowest percentage of agencies that participate in hate crime reporting.
So just very briefly on our last few seconds, it sounds like you're optimistic that this is going to secure a conviction?
Yes. And one last point, why? You're getting a massive number of counties. When you have a federal trial, you may have to have additional hurdles, but they're not higher. But you will also get an expanded jury pool that may not be affected by local gossip. Not saying there is or isn't. Additionally, you're getting the top prosecutors involved. So I would be very surprised, particularly after a state conviction, but on different information, and there's different requirements, I still think a very, very strong case. I'd be very surprised if they did not get convicted here in federal court under the 1968 statute, not the newer 2009 one.
Cal State professor Brian Levin, appreciate you breaking this down for us. Thank you very much. Today would have been the 82nd birthday of the late Congressman and civil rights icon John Lewis. And today we learned that a foundation is being established in honor of him and his wife Lillian. In the months before he died, Congressman Lewis called on young people to get into what he called good trouble. That sentiment is now a pillar of the John and Lillian Miles Lewis Foundation. According to their son, John Miles Lewis, the congressman himself laid the groundwork for this foundation. His former chief of staff, Linda Early Chastang, will run it. She plans to host a launch event in Washington this spring. You know, we try to balance the good and bad news in this pandemic. But what should the balance be? An expert on communicating science helps us reassess how we talk about and report on COVID when we come back. Two years into this pandemic, we could use more signs of progress. People are moving forward. More places are reopening. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has been swamped by COVID controversies. But today, he announced that he will lift all COVID restrictions in England.
Because of the efforts we've made as a country over the past 2 years, we can now deal with it in a very different way. Moving from government restrictions to personal responsibility. So we protect ourselves without losing our liberties.
But yesterday, Buckingham Palace announced that Queen Elizabeth II had tested positive. The palace said the Queen is experiencing mild cold-like symptoms. The Prime Minister called it a reminder that, in his words, this virus has not gone away. Meanwhile, Australia just started letting vaccinated international travelers back in. It's been almost 2 years since its government enforced some of the world's strictest pandemic measures. Meanwhile, here in the U.S., more cities are lifting their vaccine mandates. Boston, Seattle, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Minneapolis, and St. Paul have all ended their proof of vaccine requirements. The latest U.S. data shows new COVID cases at their lowest point since late November. Hospitalizations and deaths are also down significantly. And yet, it can be hard to embrace these developments. New variants could still come, so a measure of vigilance makes sense. And for some of us journalists who covered COVID up close, the last 2 years were downright traumatic. So what should we talk about when we talk about COVID today? Joining us now is Dr. Laura Lindenfeld. She's the executive director of the Alda Center for Communicating Science at Stony Brook University. Dr. Lindenfeld, welcome. Good to have you with us.
So happy to be on the show. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you very much. I wonder what your sense is, Doctor, before we talk about what we should be doing, of what we are doing. How well are we, in your view, communicating about where the pandemic stands today? And when I say we, I don't just mean like the large mainstream press. I mean us as a larger society.
Oh my gosh, when something's so complicated like COVID, the coverage is so differentiated. It's really hard to pinpoint how well we're doing. I think there's so many different communicators out there communicating in different ways. I've seen some great examples and not so great examples. I would say wherever we can bring empathy and listening to the table and understand to the best of our ability what other people are facing and experiencing, the better of a job we're going to do communicating about something like COVID.
Lean into that a little bit more in terms of empathy, understanding. What does that look like to you? Are there any places where you see that being done especially well right now or have been done especially well?
I was thinking about this conversation with you and looking at Governor Newsom's conversation, and I thought he did a really nice job in his announcement, not using jargony words like endemic, which people may not understand exactly what that term means and what it implies. So I was pleased to hear a description about what endemic might entail and how we might start to loosen up some of the constraints we've been facing, which have had huge impacts on people as well. Let me pause there for a sec.
You're talking about how Gavin Newsom kind of allowed for people, in terms of calling it an endemic rather than pandemic, basically saying, it's part of something, it's just part of life. We have to learn how to live with it and reach a place where we can sort of calibrate our responses to it. You see there on the screen his transition plan from a pandemic to an endemic response using an acronym, SMARTER, to list the different ways that California will deal with the pandemic. Is that kind of what you were talking about?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, let's face it, different audiences are going to respond differently to communication. And one of the things we do at the Alan Alda Center at Stony Brook University is we work with scientists to learn more about their audiences and what matters to them, what they care about, so that we can find some common ground and people can reach each other in meaningful ways. I like to think about the word communication and where it comes from. It's rooted in the idea of community. And I find myself, you stated this so well at the beginning of this interview with me. We're tired, we're worn down. And I think the more we can come to some sense of community around the many challenges that we faced and will continue to face, I think the more we can lift each other up through meaningful conversations.
It seems like depending on what point of the pandemic we were at, different people were getting credit/attention for the way that they're communicating. New York's former governor, Andrew Cuomo, got a ton of credit for the way that he was communicating about COVID in the very beginning. Now it's governors like Gavin Newsom who are getting credit, and we've been putting a lot of attention on people like Joe Rogan with his show on Spotify for misinformation about COVID. I wonder, though, how much we should be looking at the biggest names who are communicating with the loud megaphone, as opposed to just the way that we communicate with each other every day, whether it's day-to-day, social media, and so on. And I'm not sure what the balance is in terms of where the focus should be.
I mean, look, we're going to have national conversations and big spokespersons. I feel like if I were to add something to the mix, I'd love to see more local community-based conversations with trusted leaders. There's so much information coming at people, and it's hard to hold on to all of these facts. The more that we can process through what we're hearing and learning and apply that, the more meaningful I think it will be. Can I share an anecdote with you about my son, who's a freshman in college?
Yes, please. Please.
So he's studying for a test, and I could tell that he memorized the information. He's going to kill me for sharing this with you. Sorry, kiddo.
I will tell.
He memorized the information. I'm not going to let him watch this. He memorized the information, but I could tell in talking with him that he hadn't fully internalized it. So if he saw the exact answer, he could check it off or replicate it, but he didn't necessarily understand what it implied or how to use it. And I think when we get so many facts coming at us, we may not be able to make sense of those and make meaning of those until we've hashed through them with people we trust and can bounce ideas around with. So I'd really like to see, I think a lot about the role of healthcare professionals, barbers, religious leaders who can foster such conversations in communities where people can safely discuss what they understand and maybe what they don't, and make meaning of that together. I think that's going to become more and more important as we move into phases where things lighten up, but we're still going to have some restrictions, or those restrictions may go up and down, and that could feel very frustrating and exhausting to people.
I hear you on that, and I also think that, we've talked to a number of people, community leaders, who in their own ways have been helping kind of focus these larger conversations and just being trusted community members going forward as we have to deal with what could be a lot of back and forth. If there's another variant that forces more restrictions, or that variant turns out not to be such a big deal, give me a sense of the number one thing that you wish more people did when they communicate about science. Not just scientists, but even everyday people, just folks who have other people's attention and trust. What's the biggest thing we should bear in mind when we're trying to talk about all of this?
I think when we talk about communicating science, often people assume, get your facts ready and get ready to spew them out. And the number one thing I would wish is for more listening. So you could really get a sense of what people are saying to you before you react and respond. Look, we've had a couple of really hard years, and even with some of the restrictions around COVID loosening up, people are tired. There's other conflicts in the world. There are other problems. And I think the more we could turn down the dial on our own emotions and take a moment's pause before we react, it's very easy to overreact. I like to think of this as, we think about human beings as people who use logic, but we go through our emotions as well. And if we don't attend to that, we may pass judgments and communicate things that build more barriers rather than stronger connections. I'd love to see more connection through listening.
And in terms of how we deal with misinformation, let's say, and people's opinions about the pandemic that may not be the most valid arguments. I love what Marcus Aurelius said when he warned that you don't have to have an opinion on everything. But for people who do have misinformation and ill-formed opinions about where we are, what would you suggest in terms of how we deal with that?
One of the last things we encourage scientists to do, actually we discourage it strongly, is to try to put more facts up for people who may disbelieve what you know to be true, and to try to find some common ground. I know this sounds really wonderful in principle. It's very, very hard to do. I recently was in New York City and trying to get a bagel and a cup of coffee in the morning, and everybody was masked, and somebody came in without masks on, and they were really pushing everyone in that shop who wanted to remain masked, and the owner wanted people with masks on. And it almost got into a fight, and I thought, gosh, if we could all take a moment to breathe and turn this dial down, we might be able to move forward. It really almost exploded into a fight unnecessarily in that situation. Really what we wanted was a cup of coffee and a bagel in the morning.
Right, that's all we wanted, just to get through the morning. And I hear you in terms of trying to listen more acutely. I found the quote: "We love ourselves more than other people, but care more about their opinion than our own." I totally agree with Marcus Aurelius on that one. And I agree with you, Dr. Laura Lindenfeld. I appreciate you making time. Executive Director of the Alda Center for Communicating Science at Stony Brook University. Doctor, thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care.
You may have heard about fracking as a means of extracting natural gas, but there are other ways to get it, like landfills. One Idaho county is planning to turn its trash into gas and power. We'll show you before we go. The food we throw away often ends up in landfills. Food waste is one of America's biggest sources of greenhouse gases. It takes about a year for landfill bacteria to break down organic materials. After that year, those bacteria run out of oxygen, and then they break down waste in a process that produces lots of the greenhouse gas methane, a lot of it. Now, landfills are the third largest producers of methane gas in the country, as you can see from this chart. The leading cause is natural gas and petroleum production. Second is enteric fermentation, livestock digestion. That's the gas that cows make. The Environmental Protection Agency says methane traps heat up to 36 times more effectively than carbon dioxide does. Now, one Idaho county wants to harness that methane to make electricity. Ada County, that's the Boise area, is working with a Dallas-based company called LFG Development. The plan is to capture the methane trapped inside landfills and then turn it into power. Joining us now is Rod Beck, chairman of the Ada County Board of Commissioners. Chairman Beck, welcome. Good to have you with us.
Well, thank you. It's good to be with you.
How did this plan come about between the county and this company?
Well, we've been extracting natural gas or methane for quite a while because it is a natural byproduct of landfills. And in fact, we're required to figure out a way to dispose of it, to get it out of the landfill, because if we don't get it out of the landfill, then it permeates into the groundwater. So it's dangerous. It's dangerous for our environment. And quite some time ago, we started using the natural gas, the methane that comes out of the ground. We would turn it into electricity. We started doing that a long time ago. This is not quite what we're doing now. We're going to use all the natural gas because the two generators that we had producing electricity, it was not big enough to use all the natural gas that comes out of our landfill. And so we contracted with LFG Development to use all of the gas, and then they clean the methane up and then we pipe it to a natural gas line, and it is sold to distributors in the form of natural gas. So we'll be using, right now we only use about 45 to 50% of our methane as it comes out of the landfill. After this is all built, because it's going to be about a $25 million project, when it's all built, then we'll be using all the most of the methane that comes out of the ground. The rest of it will go into natural gas pipeline.
Talk about what has been going on in your area in terms of environmental policies and trying to respond to our changing climate. Obviously, there's a tremendous amount of agriculture in and around Boise. There's an increasing amount of oil, gas and energy exploration going on in parts of the northwestern U.S. What has this meant in terms of your area to try to deal with these greenhouse gases? I mean, has the problem been especially bad in some areas?
It hasn't been especially bad. The worst part of the project was if we didn't pull the gas out, it would permeate into the groundwater, and that's dangerous. And it poisons the groundwater, and so we don't do that. We pull it all out of the landfill, or as much as we can. We have a series of pumps and pipes and so forth, and we pull it out of the landfill, and we have been using about half of it for making electricity. But because of the growth and the more our landfill has been expanding, we have more methane than what we have capability to run through the generators. So now this will allow us to use it all. The balance of it was going up in the air. We were flaming the balance of it. But now none of it will still be a little bit of flame, but not much.
It's worth noting there is a program from the EPA called the Landfill Methane Outreach Program that also focuses on capturing methane. I think we've got a map with some of the landfills that are part of this program. We see quite a few in the eastern half of the U.S.
Right.
I wonder what your decision-making process was to continue with this Dallas-based company rather than the EPA, though I believe you had an existing contract with this company for the last few years, right?
Yeah, we have had a contract with them for several years, a number of years, and they're the ones that actually they own the generators and they sell the electricity to Idaho Power. We just get a royalty. The county gets a royalty from in fact, it's about a $360,000 royalty per year that we're getting now. With this increased production, it will generate about $1 million a year, sometimes a little more, of a royalty to the county for use at the landfill.
Before I have to let you go, Commissioner, I wonder for other counties or communities that might be considering doing something like this. There have been so many different ideas that I think local governments have tried to consider in terms of how to balance environmental needs with economic needs. What's something that you would just advise them to keep in mind as they think through their options before we go?
Well, I would just suggest that they look at all the options because there are a number of options. Again, you have to get rid of the methane gas because it is dangerous as it permeates into the groundwater. And so we've been getting rid of the methane gas for quite some time. But now we're going to be able to use all of it. And there's a number of other options. We are getting, because we just signed this contract, we are getting inquiries from all across the country on how we did it and what's the benefits of doing it, and how other landfills can go about getting rid of their methane gas as well. And I think it's going to work very well. We're sort of there's other landfills that are doing what we're doing, but we're sort of a pilot in this area anyway.
Well, I appreciate you making time to talk to us about it. I hadn't thought about methane in groundwater, but now that you mention that, I guess that does make quite a bit of sense. Rod Beck is chairman of Idaho's Ada County Board of Commissioners. Oh, I'm sorry. I wish I had more time to talk to you about it, but I appreciate you making time for us tonight. Chairman Beck, I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. And thank you for making time for us. Quick reminder, I'm going to be in Dallas next Tuesday for the State of the Union address. We're still looking for people in the area to share their real-time reactions to the speech. Specifically, we're looking for small business owners. So if you're a small business owner in Dallas or you know someone we should get in touch with, get in touch. We are at NBC Now Tonight on Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. Democrats, Republicans, Independents, I don't care about your politics. You're all welcome. You can also leave us a voicemail or email us now tonight at NBCnews.com. Until we meet again, I'm Joshua Johnson. We'll see you tomorrow. Good night.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.